We'll first hear from Dana Ingleton, who's Executive Director of HurryDocs. HurryDocs is a hub within the human rights ecosystem. It provides digital services to a great many human rights organizations. So when they get responsible AI right, it rolls out across a lot of organizations doing important work day to day, advancing human rights. We'll also hear from Hadi Al-Hatib, who is the Managing Director of Mnemonic, a documentation and archiving organization that has played a very important role in national and international accountability processes. A lot of the records that this organization has preserved have found their way into courts, into processes of advanced justice. So we're very grateful to have Hadi here with us. We will also hear from Angela Lungati, Executive Director of Ushahidi. She's also on the board of the Creative Commons, and she'll be sharing perspectives from Ushahidi's work with us. Ushahidi is a very important organization that has enabled activists and NGOs and communities to collect data about issues that are important to them and use that in advocacy. So I'm really interested to hear her perspective on this and how she is incorporating responsible AI into the services that Angela and her team provide to the human rights ecosystem. We'll also hear from Simon Angus, a professor at Monash University. Simon and his colleagues have established Soda Labs, which is a really interesting accelerator for spinning off academic research into public and social impact. And Simon and his colleagues built famously the IP Observatory, which has really become a piece of critical infrastructure for monitoring internet disruptions and internet shutdowns around the world. Simon won't be talking necessarily about that today. He's going to be presenting on how to make better use of the rich documentation that is produced by the human rights system and how that can be used in service of prevention and protection. Last but not least, we'll be hearing from Jessie M, who is Vice President of Social Good at Data She has been working with a great many civil society organizations and UN entities to help them to better sense make human rights risks, to identify leads on human rights violations, and also to sense make operational risks to their people, to their premises, to the work that they do day in, day out. So we're really looking forward to hearing from all of you. We're going to start off by turning over to Dana from HurryDocs to help frame this roundtable. Really looking forward to hearing from all of you. Just a quick note to everyone that's joined online. Please feel free to post your questions in the chat. My colleague Katya will be compiling them and will share them for the Q&A session, so please post them as they come to you. Now, of course, we don't have a huge amount of time for Q&A, so what we will do is compile them into a document and respond to them after the fact and share them with all the participants that have taken joined this roundtable. Thank you all again for joining, and without further ado, let me hand over to Dana to help frame what comes with the roundtable. Thanks, Dana. Over to you.
Thank you so much, George, and thank you to you and your whole team for putting together this incredible day, and happy International Human Rights Day to everybody at RightsX. I've been asked to basically kick us off today by starting to address the tensions that we're increasingly aware of between the dangers and risks and pitfalls of using AI. I mean, I don't think there's many places we can go without people rightfully mentioning some of the issues with AI and what that means. But the tension between those risks and those real dangers, with also, kind of needing to engage with AI and frontier technologies in order for civil society to be able to, develop and their research and their actions in timely and actionable ways that are sort of growing at pace with the rest of the world. I'll speak later on this panel about how us at Herodox are building machine learning tools in our flagship tool, Uwazi, carefully and deliberately, and always in the service of the communities we support. But the reason that I think I've been asked to start framing this discussion is that in the last number of years of developing these tools, we've been putting together, what our own sort of principles are for developing AI and machine learning in this context. And I wanted to share what those were before we kick off into our individual presentations. So one is, probably not surprisingly, security and privacy first. We need to protect sensitive data through high standards and regular audits of our tools. The second is human-centered design. We always hear the phrase humans in the loop, and this is incredibly important. We have to ensure that humans are always engaged in control of them. The third principle is open source everything. At Herodox, our models, code, and methodologies are all public and transparent. And there's an interesting discussion, in particular around AI, around engaging with big tech models or leaning into open source models, which I'll speak about more in a moment. And the fourth principle that we really try to build on is purpose-driven innovation. So meaning that, oftentimes when it comes to technology, as I'm sure everybody in this meeting and on this call knows, is that sometimes we try to shoehorn the tool that we have into problems that exist, but which should be the other way around. We should be starting with problems and building tools that really solve them. So technology, particularly in the ML AI context, should be amplifying human rights work, not dictating it. There's two other things or issues that I wanted to raise to frame the conversation today that are aligned with the principles, but one is the idea of data and infrastructure sovereignty, and the second idea is about interoperability. So when it comes to data and infrastructure sovereignty, I think right at the crux of this tension that we're talking about is that we know that the global AI ecosystem is dominated by a small number of commercial actors with often opaque and centralized LLMs. And these systems, which we also know are trained on undisclosed data and can be biased, and there's just so many issues that we've already known with those, and those systems do pose risks to civil society, including NGOs and activists and journals and educators. So this begs the question that if we're trying to fit into that model, if civil society is trying to fit into that model, there's going to be, these tensions are going to be ever more. Whereas if we try and push for a sovereign AI infrastructure that does not require surrendering data and autonomy, what does that look like? And is that something that we can do? Lastly, interoperability. I wanted to note that interoperability for too long has been sort of siloed. We've all been sort of siloed and building our tools in individual spaces, and they don't necessarily work together. And in the funding ecosystem that we're in right now, does that continue to make sense? I mean, should we be looking at making sure all of the tools that we all develop are being used for, can work together to provide a system, a suite of tools for civil society to use in these times? So I'll stop there with a quick framing of some of the sort of the ethical issues and approaches to ML and AI. And yeah, thank you so much. And in later in my presentation, I'll be able to share with you more about what we are specifically doing on machine learning at Herodox.
That covers a lot of territory, but is really useful for framing what follows. So perhaps I then hand over to Hadi. Thank you, Hadi, for joining us. Hopefully everyone can see your presentation. It's coming through now. Good. Over to you, Hadi. Thanks.
Thank you. The Human Rights Day. My presentation will be about the work that I have been doing with the team of Mnemonic, which is related to at-scale archiving digital information related to human rights violations and international crimes, and using that to support accountability mechanisms and of course also advocacy organizations. Our work started 10 years ago as a result of how social media companies are moderating content online. In the case of Syria, when I started this work 10 years ago, when I was going through reports that we have verified about attacks targeting hospitals, I've seen many of the YouTube videos that document these crimes or other social media accounts being removed from online on a very large scale as these companies announce the use of machine learning to moderate this content with very little human review. That's why our main focus 10 years ago was how to, as soon as possible, make sure that we collect this information in order for us to be able to use it in the future. And we supported different civil society organizations in Syria also to retrieve this information from those social media platforms when it was removed. But that was the case 10 years ago. Right now, it's really different. It's really hard to actually get access to information that was removed from online platforms. Our main case that we've started working on during 2000, when we started 2014, was related to the use of chemical weapons attacks in Syria. And it was very much focused into the use of sarin in Eastern Ghouta in 2013, when, as you probably all know, over 1,000 people died in one night. You can see here some of the witness testimonies from people, such as, "What I saw was unbelievable. People just were dropping dead on the streets. I went back to my house to see my children suffocating." It was one of the largest chemical weapons in modern history. And we've noticed also a huge amount of digital information published about this crime that we started collecting immediately. You can see that this information is really important for us as civil society human rights documentation organization because it shows certain things related to this crime, such as where it happened or potentially the munitions used during this crime, as you can see here also. And what we've tried to do is to organize this information after we have archived it, because as you can see here, this information right now, 10 years almost, is 2013, so over 10 years, most of this information is not online on YouTube anymore, so it's all protected within the archive. This is why we started working on different archives in different countries, such as in Yemen, Sudan, and Ukraine, in order to protect this information. And we started a global initiative called Rapid Response that also deals with information, digital information archiving and verification in Iran, Palestine, and Belarus. And our role as mnemonic is to make sure that we facilitate the use of these archives for accountability and advocacy through building technical infrastructure that is independent, that is open source. This includes the preservation software that we have developed that ensure integrity of information and authenticity of information and availability, that this information will be available for future investigations. And this is an example of how the metadata that we scrape also show on the platform. Even if this video is taken offline, we can see all the metadata related to the video, all the hashes related to data integrity of this specific video, and any kind of process that we have processed the media with. The second tool that we've been working on is also an annotation platform. So it's a place where researchers internally and externally as our partners have access to the archive and are able to view information, tag information, link information together, and create some analysis and conduct investigations using it. And this is how the interface looks like for archiving information and doing initial annotation to it, and then advanced annotation if needed. And we try as much as possible to ensure that when we design these tools, we take the well-being of researchers and partners into considerations through blurring images automatically and making sure that colors don't show or videos don't play without actually the consent of the people that are planning to verify and organize these materials. This is just to say that as we have been working on these tools and this infrastructure, we've archived over 30 million records of information from over 100,000 sources, and this is only the data related to specifically Syria. You can see from 2011 until now. So it's a large amount of information to deal with. We are also able to follow specific sources and make sure that we have specific pages for these sources that we collect information from in order to see if there are any gaps of archiving and if archiving needs to be done automatically or manually depending on the needs. And because we are trying as much as possible to try to prioritize the use of this information, we started to use machine learning to see, can we prioritize this information? Can we manage this information with machine learning, as it's a huge amount and it cannot be happening only manually. So we started an initiative internally to transcribe and translate this content automatically on a daily basis, where we are able to see the transcription also of these videos and the witness testimonies of the people that witnessed these crimes, unfortunately, transcribed and searchable and translated for research in order to access and find easily. The tools was only one part that we worked on. The other part that was really needed is a handbook where we have our policies and workflows documented. And we used for that our experience from working on these materials for years, but also the experience of other experts in the field who published certain protocols to deal with open source information, such as the Berkeley Protocol on digital open source investigations. Our research handbook contains policies such as research code of conduct, secure data sharing, how to create virtual identities and research profile to collect information, how to deal with graphic and violent content, and how to also deal with communication with civil society organizations to help us in certain research or investigations we are working on, as well as maintaining our research notes and records for documentation purposes. And the main task that we try to describe in this handbook is to collect and preserve materials, to target and organize it, to analyze it and investigate it. We do archiving because we want accountability and justice. It's not just for the sake of documentation. So we ensure that there are certain outputs out of this archive created, such as search results, thematic data sets created, chain of command of military units or non-state actors, as well as maps of areas of operation of certain units, investigation reports, incident reports, and the actual archiving materials. All these are shared with accountability mechanisms. We depended a lot in the recent years on university restrictions. We worked a lot with countries of Germany, France, the Netherlands, Brussels, and Sweden in order to use this information and make sure that we are backing up witnesses who want to claim damages and who wants to expose the violations and the crimes that them or their families have witnessed. In the case of mnemonic, we have received 37 requests from prosecution authorities as well as media, and we've answered 18 requests, but this is just to show that the reliance on digital information and this type of information is very important. As a result of our investigation on chemical weapons, a criminal complaint had been submitted in 2020. and an arrest warrant has been issued in 2025. So it took a long time, and this is really important because then we realize how archiving information is really important. Organizing it in the best way possible is important, whether manually or automatically using machine learning tools in order to actually conduct analysis and use it for legal purposes. And this was only one attack out of many chemical attacks, specifically that happened in Syria. We documented over 174 attacks using digital information. And right now we have the chance, and people are really pushing after 1 year of liberation to use these type of documentation and to push for justice and to push for transitional justice as one of the main important steps in building the Syrian society again. This is one of the witness testimonies. I survived the 2013 chemical attack on Ghouta, and I will not stay silent until those responsible for the horror I lived through the day face justice. Thank you.
I was just asking Hadi. Yeah, perfect timing. Thank you so much, Hadi. That was really useful, and I was also interested to note similar themes coming up as we heard this morning in plenary from Sam from Witness. Integrity, authenticity, protection. Really important themes. Next up, I think it's back to Dana. Thanks. So, Dana, we'd love to hear from you again, if you can, and if you can add a little bit of color to what we've just heard, that'd be much appreciated.
Great. Let me just share my presentation. Can you see my presentation? Okay.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you for that, Hadi. Excellent presentation, and always been such a fan of your work at Mnemonic. So I'm going to now share a little bit of information about Heradox and particularly our flagship documentation tool, which is called Uwazi, and the ML tools that we've been building into it. Uwazi is a documentation tool that presently around 300 civil society organizations around the world use to document human rights abuses, to keep collections and data, and more. There's actually quite a number of uses because we can create bespoke databases for specific projects with different data goals. Uwazi itself is a little over 10 years old. And in the last 4 to 5 years, we've been really trying to explore developing our own machine learning tools in order to better serve our civil society partners, to help them basically put the information that they're collecting or have collected into the service for the fight for human rights and justice. And as I said in the beginning of my, in my earlier intervention, it's important to start with the problem, not start with the solution. So before I go into the solutions that we've developed, I did want to take a minute to really unpack the problem. So, I often say that, for a long time, one of the biggest challenges for civil society collecting human rights violation information was that it was hard to find the information, hard to find the data. And now we're sort of on the flip side of that. Now it's, finding making sense of all of the information that we have. Right now, human rights defenders and human rights researchers are, they have collections of thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of documents and pages that they need to process. And because of that, no matter how good they are at their jobs, there's going to be potentially missed connections or missed patterns in the data. And trying to not miss those connections in data means that there is just hundreds of hours of manual review of documents. I think that we can all understand the pain of having to go into a PDF, sort of look what's in the PDF, try and tag it, put it into our own system so that we can better understand the data that we have. But ultimately, if we are buried under tens of thousands of pages, evidence is likely going to be lost. And that's evidence that is really crucial for fighting for justice right now. So what are those hidden costs of manual processing? Because it's those hidden costs that we're really trying to address in our machine learning work. One, I've already mentioned, is time. It can take months, weeks, or days that you don't have in developing or creating advocacy work, looking for that data, those gems of pieces of information that could make your point. Also, we have some potential accuracy problems. Critical evidence is easily overlooked, and that is also not helpful in our fight for justice at this time. And ultimately, it's our impact. And I think we can all agree that impact is such an important piece right now, particularly when human rights are being challenged the way that they are. So that's a big problem. And we wanted to break that problem into basically smaller pieces. And so the first step in breaking apart that problem for us was, you're starting with, forget the tens of thousands of documents. Let's just start with one document. And one document contains so many different little pieces of information and data. So the first thing we started looking at was paragraph extraction. So how do we use machine learning to pull out each individual paragraph of a larger document? In some documents, like the one on the screen, each paragraph is a specific recommendation that can be tagged with other pieces of data, for example. So once we do that and we automatically pull each paragraph out, then we're basically looking at, we have from one document, we now have many, many, many pieces of data, each paragraph that we can then, so that's one step of the problem. And then the next is going even further, which is metadata extraction. So we take each, document, for example, we can pull out the different codes, the dates, the countries, but also from the paragraphs that are pulled out, we can automatically pull metadata from those. And those can be lots of different things depending on what you're searching for. It can be the state that's involved. It can be the issue, whether that's labor rights, SDGs, migrants, whatever it is. And also importantly, the action, is it a recommendation? Is it a decision? Is it, there's so many different things that you can sort of tag this data on. And so basically what you're getting from there is, so you've gone from one document to paragraphs to the specifics of each one, and then you have more data points to do your searches on, and you're going to be able to find the information that you need. So this slide is showing the process of our metadata extraction. And this really goes to something that I had mentioned in my earlier intervention around the importance of having, humans involved in this. Humans in the loop isn't just a catchphrase, but it's actually incredibly important for developing these tools. So the process for us is creating the extractor in the first place. So defining with our partners, what are those inputs and outputs? Like, what do they need extracted from that? And then manually labeling the data. So going in and being like, this is a country, this is the action. And through doing that over and over with our partners, we're training the systems. Then the next step is that we basically test the system. So the system spits back out to us, okay, we think this is the country, we think this is the action, we think this is whatever it is. And then we go through and verify. So, yep, that's correct. You've learned it properly. And then as you do that more, the system gets smarter and you have to give less and less feedback. I'm not going to let this whole video show, but we'll be sharing the presentations with everybody after. And this is just a quick video showing what I just explained, this process of training for metadata extraction in a video. But I won't let the whole video play for now in the means of time. So in practice, this can have huge impacts for our partners and for everyone in civil society. One example that I'd like to bring is our good friends at UPR Info, who after a UPR session or review session, they have so many documents coming from civil society, from governments, et cetera. And what used to take them weeks to months to sort of process all of these things and get them tagged into their database now can be in a matter of days to weeks. So it can really show that information then becomes available for those working on advocacy related to the countries who had just gone through the UPR review. So going back to, the principles that I mentioned earlier, it's really important to have security and privacy at the forefront, that human-centered design, keeping humans in the loop, open sourcing everything, and being really purpose-driven, really responding to the issues at hand. So one of the things that we also talk about is how to succeed in using these features, right? Because I did talk about, you do have to go in and manually label the extractor. You do need to go and sense check what the tool has done. So one thing is that we really encourage people to invest in the time to experiment. And I know that can be particularly challenging, particularly so, in donor situations where you really want to be meeting your objectives and pushing things forward. But the reality is that we need sort of space to play and experiment and see what's going to work. And those feedback loops with people who are using these tools is incredibly important to know what's helping them in the fight for justice. And the next one is a really important one. Trust unlocks speed. We all have a very healthy, we're all very healthily weary of using big tech AI systems. I think we all know you can't trust ChatGPT. You got to fact check it. In this system that we've developed, because you as the user is going in and verifying what the system has learned, you start to trust that it's giving you the right answers because you've seen the answers that it's spitting out and you've been training it. And that means that eventually you can move faster. If it gives you an answer, you don't need to necessarily go back and fact check it because you've trained it and you trust the system. The last is that expertise is definitely required. AI amplifies expertise. It doesn't replace it. I'll just say really quickly a few things about going forward, because this has just been one example of our machine learning tools. At Heradox, we are looking at developing machine learning tools that help us across the documentation workflow. So you can see here from collecting information with crawlers. You'll see heavily we're in the organization, which makes sense. Information is our bread and butter. So we're looking, we've been building automatic translation, automatic table of contents, named entity extraction, text, and then moving into text references, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we're really looking to build a system, an ecosystem of machine learning tools within Uwazi that help people process information throughout their documentation workflow. We hope to be launching a global repository of human rights information where we can have a bit of a playground for all these tools and show people how they can be useful going forward for keeping pace in our human rights research and advocacy. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you very much. And there's lots of different places that you can find more information about us, about Uwazi, and about our machine learning tools. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you so much. That was really rich. A lot to unpack. I hope we have time in Q&A to dive into different elements of that. But thank you for sharing that overview. I'm delighted now to pass on to Angela from Ushahidi. Angela, while you were joining, I took the liberty of introducing you all the same and highlighting that since the dawn of the social web, you've been empowering activists and communities and organizations, helping them to develop data to increase their agency and advocacy platforms. But much better that we hear it from you directly. So thank you so much for joining, and over to you.
No, thank you, George. I hope you can all hear me clearly. Can you? All right, perfect. Thank you for that kind introduction. It's an honor to be able to participate, albeit virtually. But yeah, so just like George said, my name is Angela Lungati, Executive Director at Ushahidi. I run a nonprofit technology and data company that's called Ushahidi. We've really been focused on surfacing community-generated data to drive impact across various sectors using open source tech over the last 16 years, and really engaging with disenfranchised communities to play active roles in building sustainable futures and also fighting for social justice. So in many ways, like just listening to the presentations just made, we're complementary to some of the work that say Heradox and Mnemonic do, in the sense that the kind of documentation that is gathered on our side is really people's lived experiences, and it helps to kind of augment all of the other work to try and build a database of evidence that can be used to hold people accountable. Next slide. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about the history, but just run you through what the kind of work that we've done, and then talk a little bit around what we are learning in the space, and how that's influencing how we show up in terms of innovating around human rights protection work. So Ushahidi began in 2008 during the Kenyan election. It really started as a platform for citizens to report incidences when official information systems were failing. You know, many of us were stuck in our houses. We didn't know what was happening in different pockets, and the founders set up this web platform that allowed us to text in or send in emails or pull out tweets around what was happening. And so it really helped to create a space for people to get a better situational awareness of what was going on in the months and years after that, potentially also using that to hold people accountable. And that really is the origin of Ushahidi, this platform that has ended up being used in more than 160 countries. Next slide. Our work is primarily focused on maybe four impact areas. First one being humanitarian and disaster relief. I think that's the one that many people know us for. Human rights protection is another strong anchor, just really finding ways of surfacing human rights violations with the name of not only creating awareness, but trying to figure out how we can use that data to change behavior. There's also good governance to work around corruption mapping and election monitoring, but also building climate resilience. And across all of these domains, our aspiration really is systemic change. We want citizens to feel more included in solutions being built around the problems that affect them. We want the organizations that serve these communities to be more effective, and we also want policy to reflect the realities of everyday life. Next slide. We know from experience that meaningful and lasting change can't happen without data that's inclusive and truthful. And so we want to help people everywhere to easily gather data and generate insights that will help them tackle issues that matter them.
We've lost our connection to Angela. Yeah. Okay, maybe we can return to Angela's presentation. Oh, here she is again. Angela, you back?
Hi.
Hi, we
I'm
lost
so
about
sorry.
the last 30 seconds. So if you wind back.
The last 30 seconds? Okay.
Yeah.
All right, let me do that again. So I'll just start off with what I was saying about this.
And now you're on mute, possibly, or it's the connection again. It seems you can hear us at least.
Maybe you should turn off the video feed.
Yeah, perhaps.
Audio.
Yeah. Do you hear that, Angela? Perhaps turn off video feed.
This works.
I've been assured it always works. We're still not getting any audio feed. Perhaps we take a pause and then come back to you. And I now use the opportunity to hand over to Simon, potentially. But we know where we are in the presentation. We can come back to this in a second. But Simon, I think Dana has set up your presentation quite well. Presenting on some metadata extraction and UPR. There's some quite interesting elements there. But really looking forward to hear more from you about an ASCENT initiative that's developing at the moment. Thanks for joining us, Simon. Over to you.
Thanks very much, George, and thank you for having us from Australia in Melbourne. So we at Soda Labs, which George mentioned, amongst other things, run the Monash IP Observatory, which measures the internet at global scale and yeah, probably Angela's internet is suffering. We probably would be measuring that at the moment and be able to report on some anomalies. We've had a really long-standing partnership over the last 5 years with UNHR, and it's been very fruitful. We've learned a lot from them and sought to serve them with both our data, also our anomalies and insights around how that works. But as George mentioned today, the conversation is an evolution of that relationship, trying to think through how we can work with our multidisciplinary hats around AI, machine learning, and quantitative social science to help UNHR and others think about risk of future violations. So Dana has indeed set it up well. Here is a problem that we are trying to help tackle, and we have many problems that follow from that. So if we can have a look at the first slide, then yeah, so this is the question really, can we predict human rights violations with modern tooling? And I mentioned some of the other of my team who are here with me working on this at Monash University. Next slide, thank you. So as we've seen, what we have at the moment is a number of organisations doing absolutely fabulous and important work, archiving, documenting, and really carefully extracting metadata and so on from human rights violations and other events occurring around the world. And that is crucial. What we also do quite well is we have a number of organisations who produce some sort of tracking of those, some sort of analysis on top of that to, once converted the text or video as an alternative data form, as Dana so nicely showed before, extracting out, whether it's the paragraph or the sentence level, the recommendation level, what we now would refer to as data, in the sense that it has some sort of component that we can then work with downstream. This is Civic Space Pulse that the UN has itself been working on and is an example of the kind of tracking activities. What we notice in these, and if you look at the time series that's a bit small below in terms of things occurring around the world, whether that's looking at protest events and the ways that these might get intervened by authorities and so on, is there does seem to be some degree of relationship amongst them in the respect that the more that you see something happening today, the more likely it happens tomorrow. So there's what we would call temporal correlation. That suggests to us that there's probably patterns, and that suggests the next question, which is the driving question for a project we're just embarking on with the UNHR, which is, I guess it'll be the next slide, asking this question of, can we actually predict, are there actually patterns that are available to us to try and understand the risk of future events occurring at a place and a time. So quickly, you've seen a little bit of the machinery, I guess, before in other presentations, but our plan is to work with the documents that we have, and I think some of the partners here producing some excellent archival information as well, to use extraction methods to identify at a fairly granular level human rights violations, to combine these with traditional data concerning economic and social conditions and freedoms. We know that one of the triggers for unrest is often economic conditions as well, or combined with the lack of political freedoms and crackdowns. And so these are stressors which can often point to the possibility of future conflict or at least human rights violations. We know as well that times around political events, whether they be timetabled elections, referenda, or the speeches and announcements from certain opposition parties, if they're allowed to exist in countries, can also be moments when we know tension arises. So the challenge here is to combine these sources of information to try to make forecasting tools using time series analysis and so on, that we might be able to give some 1, 2, 4 weeks ahead risk assessment. And the reason for that, the kind of driving, I guess, aim, is that we would like to be able to give the UN and other actors some information as a leading indicator so they can be proactive when it comes to trying to reduce and de-escalate the situation, and possibly to, as others have already mentioned, and those of us who are in the monitoring or measuring game, as we are at the observatory, we sometimes would like to increase the amount of monitoring when we see tensions rising, because it becomes even more important to put in place those abilities for whether it's citizens or for our infrastructure to measure what's going on, because we have a sense that something important is about to go down and human rights violations may be part of that, and we may need to be able to document them for future action. Next slide, please. There are a number of risks that are involved with predicting human rights risks. So we can talk a little bit about that. Firstly, of course, as Dana has mentioned already, ground truth is very important. And so we have done a number of exercises previously to work with domain experts. I fully agree and support the idea that experts are critical to this, and it's their expertise which is crucial to driving accuracy here. So our partnership with you and HR is really important for understanding the provenance of the data and how it will be converted into some sort of labels or text that we can use downstream. There are a number of complexities here. Reports about human rights violations or actions in countries happen obviously in multi-languages, in a number of different styles, in a number of different document formats, whether it's from the Human Rights Council or desk reports, etc. So approaches need to be robust to these different styles. And there are a number of risks that are involved here, which are probably the ones that we carry over from our work at the Monash IP Observatory on anomalies and shutdown and slowdown events. We always worry about missing signals. The problem for there is that we can inadvertently give the impression that there is no action occurring in a place or a time, and that can make it look for example, an authoritarian leader, an ability for them to say, well, look, some objective measurement apparatus or prediction tool has said there's no problem, so everyone needs to calm down, when in fact, actually, there might be a real problem. So that's a major risk. The other one, of course, is we have overestimating the boy who cried wolf problem. So we may have a prediction tool which is too flighty, and therefore we end up distrusting signals. So the veracity of the signals is really important. And then the other problem that probably will occur here is that although there is relationships in time, kind of the best prediction probably of a future human rights violation is one that happened recently in a location. We have the issue that there might be long periods where there is no action occurring, and predicting something happening from nothing is quite a hard problem to encounter and to deal with. So that will be the work ahead of us as we try and work on this, but we believe AI tooling, machine learning tooling that we're familiar with will have, I think, in the right hands, a capability here that might really be useful for hopefully our end users, who will be citizens around the world, who might like to know that someone is able to provide some lead indicator and hopefully avoid these sorts of violations before they occur, possibly through intervention, possibly through just letting people know we're now looking and watching and adding that transparency and accountability. And I probably, like most people here, I would welcome those of you who might be on the call who would like to get involved or add your expertise to our own. By all means, reach out to us at Soda Labs. Thanks, George.
And I heard some grunts of potentially agreement when you were going through the risks in the room. So we'll get some interesting discussion in the Q&A on that. I've also heard from Angela that she's back online. Angela, can you hear us and can you reconnect? And we'd
Yes,
love
I
to.
can. Yes, I can.
Brilliant. Perhaps back over to you to continue where you left off, and then we'll head over to Jesse. But thanks again, Simon, for stepping up quickly. And over to Angela again.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I'm not quite sure exactly what happened. So I've switched browsers. I hope that will be stable enough for today. What I will do is I will turn off my video just for posterity's sake, just in case. So I think what I was trying to communicate at the point when I dropped off was that, we know from experience that the change we're all looking for can't happen without data that's inclusive and truthful. And so when we think of what our purpose is as Ushahidi, is to really help people everywhere to gather data easily so that you can then generate insights to help you tackle issues that matter the most to you. We want to make sure that local communities are able to share their lived experiences in ways that help them get the outcomes they want. That decision makers have access to knowledge that will allow them to better support these communities based on those insights. And that over time, we can also start to look at community-generated data sets as public goods that can really improve society. I think if these elements can come together, then we really can make progress in the fight for social justice. Go to the next slide. So allow me to use this analogy of a farm to drive an important point home. Digital platforms like Corridor, Mnemonic, and Ushahidi are like fertile land. They really do represent the potential for greater participation, improved decision making, and trust in many ways. And then the data and information that's gathered from these platforms are like having good seeds that will flourish and yield produce if they are appropriately handled. And then we have the people themselves, the farmers, the ones who understand the soil, the weather, the history, and the tensions. And so in the same way that a farm cannot flourish without people tending to it, I think it's important for us to recognize that we will not win this fight for social justice without those whose lived realities, without those people whose lived realities we are fighting for in every day, contributing their insights into some of the solutions that we're trying to build. Next slide. And I think of technology as a useful means to an end, something that can really help to facilitate deep engagement with these marginalized and disenfranchised communities by meeting audiences where they are. And at Ushahidi, what we've tried to do over the years is design tools to meet people where they are, while recognizing that this will continue to evolve as we are. So for those of you who don't know, our legacy platform is open source and free. It works on basic mobile phones or smartphones, and it also supports multiple languages so that people can express themselves comfortably. And these decisions that we made in this design were not accidental. They were done to ensure that even the most marginalized groups can participate in shaping the data that ultimately informs interventions to fight for human rights or protect democracies around the world. Next slide. And this commitment to accessibility is one of the reasons why we've seen the platform being used in more than 160 countries. This is a tool that was born out of problems you always tend to associate with Africa, that is now powering civic engagement, crisis mapping, community intelligence efforts around the world. And that global adoption tells us something important, that communities everywhere want to be a part of the conversation. They want to be a part of the solution to the problems that are facing them. Next slide. There are several examples of how Shahidi has been used, and specifically within the human rights space. I think of the very first one, the genesis of the Ushahidi platform, documenting crimes during the elections. I look at protests around the world, most recently, whether that is the Reject Finance Bill protest in Kenya in 2024, the protests in Nigeria around NSAS. It really has been a way of, it's not just data, it's evidence that when people are given accessible ways to share what they're experiencing, they will contribute, and that those contributions will have real value in shaping interventions, in shaping policies, and how we show up. For over a decade, we've argued and proven that insights from ordinary citizens can help provide a richer understanding of some of the world's most pressing challenges. This kind of intelligence helps to reveal things that top-down systems will tend to overlook, whether that's spotting the early signs of voter suppression or identifying gaps in humanitarian response. This community-generated data really does provide the context we need to understand what's going on. Next slide. But it's also important to remember, again, I'll sound like a broken record, technology is a means to an end. And in an ever-changing technology landscape, we really have to adapt, not just the tools, but the way our tools engage with the communities that we seek to serve. And in the recent months at Ushahidi, we really have been in that reflective space to think about how we can meet this moment in ways that will prioritize these vulnerable communities that we seek to serve and allow them to tell their stories better so that they're able to solve problems in their communities. And it started looking at the landscape 17 years ago when we began, right? It was the advent of increased mobile connectivity on the African continent, increased mobile penetration. You pair that up with the rise of social media platforms, and we found ourselves really innovating around mobile phones to help people raise their voice. And it made a lot of sense. I think we saw a huge surge in people wanting to express themselves and using the platform to document what was happening around them. Next slide. And then we look at the world we're living in today. AI is here. It is revolutionizing how we work, how we learn, how we show up. And there also seems to be an increased want or push to delegate tasks and even our cognitive capacity for the sake of increased productivity, along with all the things that this gathering has been helping us to show as well. And at the same time, there's a sense of fatigue from local communities. We've been calling it research fatigue. People are saying that they are tired of having to come in and fill pre-described forms with lengthy questions, right? People are used to their data or their information flowing naturally into the processes that use it, of course, in responsible ways. But people aren't seeking things that will require them to remove themselves from their everyday lives so they can come in to do something that other actors have defined. And so what that means for, not just for Shahidi, but for anyone who's building technology platforms, we really need to think about how to reduce friction of engagement with these communities, right? If we're looking to engage with these communities at scale, we really need to think about how we meet them where they are. Next slide.
Ask you to
And
wrap
also,
up, if you could.
Oh, I need to. Okay, I will do my best.
Thanks a lot. Thanks.
Okay, I'll do my best. So maybe, just to summarize this slide as well, recognizing the moment that we're in, I think we've heard a lot about how the fight for human rights is, the pace needs to increase because the risks are being exacerbated by the platforms that we're using. So the work that technology platforms like ourselves and others represented in the room today that work is still important. And so for us, next slide, what that has led us to is building this new thing that we're calling distant voices that will not only allow us to rethink how we gather data from local communities, really allowing them to share their data in ways, in their natural form, whether that's voice notes or plugging into places where conversations are already happening, but also leveraging the years of data that have been collected over the last 17 years to pair up with our current understanding of what's going on, so that we have both a historical perspective as well as a current one that has been increased at scale to shape our thinking around how we show up. And I can talk about this in a bit more detail later for those of you who are interested. Next slide. I think the next one actually. I believe we're all on the same page in recognizing the promise that responsible and trustworthy AI holds to solve local problems. We need AI that will center values of privacy and trust, give people agency in deciding how their data is used, fairness, minimizing harm, bias, and exploitation, not exposing people to risk, and also helping people understand the systems built and the potential for harm. And I think the entire discussion we've had today, whether it's in the high-level dialogue or even today, have highlighted the roadblocks and challenges we're facing in this regard and the deep negative impact that it's having on human rights. So how do we even begin to make this right? We need to remember that context is everything, that we shouldn't be trying to copy and paste solutions from one place to another. We have to give space for adaptation, embedding cultural norms and differences into any governance models we develop around how technology tools are built and used. And we're also going to need partnerships to really fully realize this future where human rights are adequately protected and promoted, right? I think I talked about this in my remarks earlier today, and I'll reiterate it. We need to move into a space of proactive, collaborative rights by design innovation that has strong policy guardrails, better digital literacy, and real collaboration between different actors, those of us building the tech, policymakers, and the local communities, and work even more to educate, do more work on digital literacy and public awareness so that people are also able to understand what their rights are and join those of us working for this fight along with us, giving them agency. Thank you, George, and sorry for the struggles with the connectivity and for taking long with my presentation. Thank you.
It's been great since you're able to rejoin. Really inspiring as ever. Thank you so much, Angela. Meeting people where they are. This point around working together. I think I can see a lot of synergies across all of these presentations. So I'm happy now to hand over to Jessie End. Jessie, perhaps give us a sense of your work and perhaps some lessons on building collaborations across sectors and institutions and organizations.
Of
Thanks
course.
a lot.
Thanks, George. Thanks for having me. I'll try and keep it brief because I want to make sure we have time for Q&A, because I often find that to be the most valuable portion of these kinds of roundtables. Just to kind of queue up or wrap the conversation, pull some threads together. I think we've heard a lot about how you can use data and artificial intelligence to support looking backwards and understanding trend analysis and documentation. We also heard from Simon about the sort of predictive or the future looking view on using these technologies for protection. Where Data Miner comes in, what our core capabilities are actually in real-time detection. So Data Miner at its heart is a real-time event and risk detection platform. And I joined the company about going on 5 years ago to figure out how else we could see potential and how the platform could be used for social impact areas, including human rights. But once I joined, I also recognized that one of the strengths of Data Miner is in fact our AI research team. And also one of the challenges in working in the social impact arena is that, and we've heard this from some of the other speakers, is as a private sector company, we aren't built for purpose, right? So what could we do to further our impact as a company in supporting nonprofit organizations using our AI research team? So in 2022, we ran our first pilot of our AI for Good program with UN Human Rights. And then we launched an RFP in 2023. And Ushahidi was one of our partners for our first official round of AI for Good, in which we work in deep, long-term collaborations to build built-for-purpose custom AI models to support mission initiatives. So per George's request, I want to share a little bit about what are some of the considerations when you're partnering, and specifically given my role at a private sector company, what kinds of considerations when partnering across those two sectors. So I think the onus is on both parties when you're looking at the social impact organization and the private sector partner to both self-evaluate, but also evaluate your partner on a few criteria. When it comes to the social impact organizations, one of the things we've learned is it's really important to make sure that the projects you're working on with them are aligned with their key priorities. And there are a few sort of indicators to look for in that area, including, has this organization made previous attempts to solve the problem that they are proposing to address with data science or artificial intelligence? Is there sort of a track record of investment on their part, not necessarily paying for solutions, but investment in technical resources and staff time on those projects? That's a really key thing, because these projects take time. They take long-term investment in the relationship to make sure they succeed. So we're always looking for partners that have sort of demonstrated commitment and alignment of the project with those top priorities. And sort of related to that is staffing and resources. So the time, but also the technical expertise. In full transparency, we've wound up in projects where the project went really well, but at the end, they didn't actually have the technical expertise to implement it. Feels a little bit like what happens when you work with maybe like a management consulting firm that spends a year researching something for you and giving recommendations, and then it sits on the binder on the shelf. The last thing you want to do is build a custom AI model that never gets used. So I think making sure that there's investment in and technical know-how as to how to implement it, and that those conversations are had early on in the partnership so that you can fill those gaps if needed. On the private sector side, I think the due diligence is even more critical, and we've heard a lot of the reasons through the previous presenters. Obviously, safety is one of the primary concerns when working with the private sector. And I think Dana mentioned this, but data sovereignty So when you're thinking about partnering with the private sector, really understanding what data is going to be used in this project and how is that organization going to use and protect that data, and also the outputs, right? So how will the model, who owns the models and how will those be used? On our AI for Good program, when we're selecting which organizations to work with, we're very careful. We've had some really promising proposals for projects to work on, but that dealt with very deeply sensitive data. And so we've declined those projects simply because we didn't feel like we had the ability to work with that data in a safe way. So making sure that your project has those sort of guardrails and that your project partner is considering those guardrails as well. When we do these projects, as for like this, beyond the data, but the outputs itself, the contracts we sign with our partners essentially give ownership of the models to the social impact partner. And that is both because for the safety processes, and that's not something, it's something we are building to be used in these protected ecosystem by experts who know how to continue to safeguard that use. But it is also because we believe that that is a way of investing in the longevity of the outcomes. So when we hand the models over, we can see that our partners and UN Human Rights and Ushahidi are great examples, continue to iterate on those models because they own them and they have the full documentation of how they were built, and continue to expand on them to drive even greater impact. We also heard built for purpose. That's something too, right? Dana mentioned this, so I won't belabor the point, but really making sure that the partners you're working with are not shoehorning their product into your solution, or you're shoehorning their product into your needs, but that the solutions are built for purpose. I also think there's a separate sort of bi-directional consideration, which is what types of organizations do you want to work with? For us, and I would encourage if there are any other private sector partner in this session, we've been very intentional about trying to work with a broad set of organizations, from relatively small to large international groups like UN Human Rights, and specifically to work with local organizations. Working with Ushahidi, which is based in the Global South, was a deliberate, intentional move, because I do think these conversations tend to be dominated by the usual players. And the reality is they're incredible builders, AI builders and practitioners in the Global South. And I think private sector has the ability to influence the localization movement by intentionally choosing to work with Global South partners. So that's just one other thing I would throw in there. I think it's incredibly important too, because of sort of, to Angela's point, the voices that you are helping to elevate in that process. Just a few other really quick things to be mindful of time. I would say defining the problem really clearly at the beginning, spending as much time as you need in scoping a project that you're partnering on, so everybody knows what is the goal, what are the priorities. You can't overinvest in time spent on scoping the project. Clearly defining deliverables, what you can and can't deliver as part of that partnership, which responsibilities will continue, and what kinds of documentation needs to be handed over for that project to expand, right? So the projects we've worked on, we hand over all that documentation so they can continue to iterate. George, I'm sure, can share at another point how they've taken the model we built with them and use it in all sorts of other contexts. So really understanding what that full process is at the start, so you can make sure that the project has longevity. Feasibility questions are really important. I've mentioned a few in terms of like choosing your partner. The other thing I would say is just data availability, like for the lack, at the risk of stating the obvious, many of these projects are limited by the amount of data that's available, the quality of that data, and sort of like how well tagged is that data, how usable is that data. Thankfully, there's a bunch of partners on this call that have built solutions that help with that, but AI is only ever as good as the data that is available. And finally, I think the other point is really around just the ethical considerations of these partnerships. There's a lot of existing frameworks out there that private partners should learn, and social impact partners should educate private partners on if they're not aware. But transparency, justice, and fairness, these are all sorts of really important considerations in working with the private sector. I'll just say, because there's a slide up here, from a transparency standpoint, we are a private sector organization. There's all sorts of questions that can be raised about AI companies. One of the things that I do to answer that question is to create our pro bono program. So the Data Miner for Nonprofits program offers free licenses to qualified nonprofits for our real-time alerting platform. So if you either are curious about how our data can be used for human rights, or you want to sort of stress test the protections that we have in place and how we do our alerting, you can use this QR code and submit an interest form, and qualified nonprofits can get those free licenses. So I'll end there because I want to make sure we have time for Q&A.
Much, Jesse. That was enlightening. I think your points on as good as the data available is the one that I'd like to use to then head into the Q&A. Sam Gregory in his keynote spoke a lot about the risks that we face, the sort of breakdown of a consistent public sphere, issues around integrity. And we've had a nice question from Janine Braff from the Stabilization Platform in the chat, and she asks, basically, how do you avoid utilizing biased or false information? And I mean, that's predominantly targeted at Simon, but I think it's a good question for all of the panelists. So I'm going to invite Hadi to kick us off, and then we'll go through the others. If you can just give us your quick take on that, how do you handle that? Thanks.
Thanks, George. Mnemonic verification is a very essential step of our workflow. And by verification, I mean answering the traditional investigation questions of who, what, when, where, why. For example, we look at audiovisual content, so geolocating images and videos, verifying dates and times, and making sure that we corroborate information from as many sources as possible in order to answer these questions. So we've become really good from the presentation. You can hear about how to collect information, how to organize information. But when it comes to organize it, when it comes to verification, it's still very much a manual process that is really needed in order for us to be using this information in a relevant way, whether for legal purposes and advocacy purposes.
Thanks, Hadi. And I think that answer really speaks to your point, Dana, around AI amplifying expertise. Perhaps you want to come in with a perspective on the question around information integrity, avoiding using biased or false information. Over to you, Dana. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, for us, there's two sort of angles to the answer to that question. As Hadi was talking about, there's also, like verifying information to be eventually used as evidence, and actually sort of having a system where evidence that's been collected could withstand, for example, chain of custody examinations in various cases, so that once information has been verified by people who are using it, it's stored somewhere where we can show it hasn't been tampered with. And then, so that's a really important angle of the verification. And because, as we know, many human rights defenders and activists are attacked, and some people are attacked saying that actually, they are being smeared because they're using AI to develop this stuff, right? So that verification and secure storage is extremely important. And then again, this sort of goes to the open source everything, not the data, but the code, to show how systems work to verify the outcome that is there, right? Because in a world where there's so much concern about bias with AI and ML systems, in a world where people instinctively don't trust it, and then we're using these tools to show trends as evidence, we also need to build trust in the tools that we're building in order to verify those trends that come out the other end as well.
See, we're at time, but if it's okay with everyone, I think we continue a little bit beyond the allocated time because we're rolling into lunch at our end. Is it okay to the speakers if we keep going for another five or 7 minutes? I see nods. Okay, fantastic. With that in mind, Angela, perhaps over to you for your perspective on that question.
Yeah, I think my perspective is actually very similar to Hadi's. So that challenge around verifying information is something that we've had from the very onset of the design of the Ushahidi platform. And I think it's just gotten even more complicated, to be very honest, with emerging technology. It really is becoming difficult to detect what's true and what isn't. But how we've tried to address that challenge is much like Hadi. It's a manual process is involved, and this is where this idea of partnerships also comes in, right? Like, how are we working with fact-checking organizations on the ground? How are we working with other community-based organizations that can help us to corroborate the information that is coming through, while also trying to see what are the other ways that we can leverage technology to support with that, things like how do we detect whether an image is real or AI generated? How do we detect from the metadata, is this something that was shared years or months ago versus something that is in the present? So it is something that requires both of those things. So in a nutshell, leverage your partnerships to handle the manual side, but recognize the limitations that technology will have, but then see how you can also leverage little bits of it.
And I was just being pointed to another question that had come in via the survey as well. Simon, this question was actually directed specifically towards you. So perhaps over to you for your response. Thanks.
Yeah, briefly, I mean, I mentioned in the chat already, I think it's a fantastic point. This is actually the internet's problem. It's not only human rights area. And that's where working with domain experts and expertise when it comes to verified reports and so on, or post hoc verification methods, the meticulous work that people are doing on this call is so important. That's our defense. And I mean, that's for us on this particular project, that's where we'll begin. So-called the official record. And we will be relying on those human and human validated methodologies on this score. I would just add that from a kind of academic perspective of the world, I glibly say it's the internet's problem. It's an increasing problem. I have on my desk already today another request about people who do surveys of in-country trust in government and so on. There's a reducing number of pool of real humans willing to answer surveys. And then even then, when people answer yes, they have AI answering surveys to do it quickly. So this is obviously potentially undermining some of the key indicators of democratic resilience and trust in government and so on, if we end up having a lack of information. So yeah, it's a challenge we're all facing, but again, the human touch and expertise is going to be most important in how we build and design, how we co-design, how we evaluate, and how we monitor from there.
Welcome a perspective from you on this.
Yeah, so I'll answer this through the lens of our core event and risk detection platform. So we have made a proactive decision not to be arbiters of the truth. We are not necessarily domain experts, although our humans in the loop are called domain experts and they do some verification on the back end. But data miners' primary focus is to provide life-saving information at the speed at which it is happening. And so the way we actually support our users with verification is that our AI is trained to recognize these events and then to update them as soon as there is additional information. So the best example I got of this when I joined the company was that we might send an alert that says shots fired in Times Square because someone posts something on public social media, they hear a noise, they assume it's a gunfire. But as soon as there's another post that says, or some other publicly available information that counteracts that, for example, this is a true story, that in fact it was a motorcycle backfiring, we provide another alert that says, no worries, no shots fired, this was a motorcycle backfiring. That happened, that example happened within under a minute that the ground truth was updated. And so that's kind of how we do it, is we don't sort of remove information, because if it is critical life-saving information, we want people to have it as soon as possible, but we update it as soon as there is information that changes that ground truth.
Information quality improves over time.
Okay.
Perhaps if there's interest, just one question from the room, and then we'll need to wrap up. But we do have a survey where you can ask additional questions, and we will respond to them. Also, there's been some fascinating initiatives presented today. So if there's interest in collaboration, of course, you can reach out directly to these people, but also please feel free to enter that into the survey. But yeah, I look to the room. Does anyone wish to answer a question? I'll ask a question in here. Please.
Well, I've got many questions regarding the participation of DataMiner as well as Palantir and other profit companies, but I'll save those for later. I did just want to raise one particular issue that I'd love to obviously have some reaction to, and that's the question of our continuing obligation to manage and protect our data within the humanitarian data protection protocols, which have just been released and updated last week at ICRC. My concern is that, on the one hand, we are religiously militant and protective of all of our sensitive data about vulnerable communities and populations. And on the other hand, we are engaging very excitedly with all of these amazing new AI tools. And the problem for me is that we don't fundamentally understand where these tools reside. Are they really running on my laptop, or are they magically running on a server in a different international or national legal regime, most notably the United States? What's happening to all of this very sensitive data that's being pushed deliberately into all of these amazing AI services? My fear is that we are essentially creating a huge amount of potential risk and harm because the data is leaking out in ways that we fundamentally are not aware of. The second thing I would really like to have a discussion about is the question of what we collectively do with all of these amazing AI tools. Now, there is an inherent tension and contradiction between an open source tool that we produce and share collectively and the concept of open data. And the problem is they tend to be conflated and used interchangeably, but open data, as far as I'm concerned, is, when it is defined by Americans, it is fundamentally in contradiction and incompatible with humanitarian data protection standards. Open data means we give up all of our rules about data protection. Essentially, it goes into the cloud and it's for anyone to use for any purpose. And my concern is that when we build these AI models, what the first thing we should do is adopt a precautionary standard and not dump this into GitHub, because that's what American open data people do. We need to have the models shared, but they must be curated behind a shared, basically a humanitarian hub that manages access to authorized users. If I develop, for example, and when I was at Human Rights Watch and we talked about building some AI models, and let's build an AI model that detects child soldiers. Well, what happens if that model's on GitHub and some adversarial actor decides to download that model and put it into their autonomous lethal robot? to target children. I mean, abstractly, our wonderful applications for our models could be weaponized to cause profound harm. And I think our obligation should never be to just willfully dump these models into the public domain because of that inherent risk.
Thank you. Dana, your intervention early on, I think, touched on some of these issue around sort of sovereignty of infrastructure and models, and then this sort of tension with interoperability and collaboration, how we can make the most of the scarce resources that human rights organizations have. Would you like to comment on this point as in wrapping up before we close?
Yeah, I have so much to say about this sovereign infrastructure and interoperability. This is a big question to end on. But I did note that I think Angela wanted to jump in and answer this question first. So I'm happy to give you the floor, Angela. And if there's a minute, I'll jump in with our perspective on sovereign infrastructure, because it is arguably where we need to go. But Angela, I know you wanted to jump in first.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it underscores one thing that I said in my presentation, that context is really key here, right? The way technology is applied in the human rights space will be very different from the way it will be used in an entirely different sector. And those are things that I don't think are being factored into the design of the tools. It's almost like we're trying to apply a blanket approach around how AI systems are used across all sectors. That's point number one. Point number two is going back to what I said before, tech as a means to an end. I think we also think critically around, why do we want to use AI in these contexts? And then design from that perspective. So we're designing with the problem first. And I think this is something that the wider African technology ecosystem is actually is trying to deal with. I think there's an assumption that the AI tools that we need to leverage are the ones that are being built by the select few right now. And that's a false narrative. That is a false narrative. We actually have agency to produce tools that will be appropriate for the context that we want to use them in. And so maybe one of the things that we need to do is take a bit of a step back and think about the problem that we're trying to solve at this moment, evaluate against what exists within the market, yes, but then see, is there something different that we need to adapt, or is there something else that we need to build to fit into this? And then third, just really quickly, this question around open, I think openness and open source is really being put to the test in this emerging technology ecosystem, because the values that it espouses is reciprocity, open knowledge, open sharing, it's not quite matching with how things are playing out right now. You know, it really is promoting extractivism. There's all the risks that have been mentioned right now. So that's another conversation that we need to have. So let me pass it back on to Dana. Thank you for giving me the mic.
Of course. Yeah, I mean, what Angela said, right? I mean, I think one of the big issues that we have is that people assume when we talk about AI, which is, actually a huge packet of different kinds of technologies and tools, that we're automatically meaning LLMs made and controlled by big tech, right? And yes, then that data that we're putting in, data from the ground, would be fed back into those, and that is potentially very dangerous. But that's not the only option for our operating systems, right? One is, as Angela mentioned, what's the actual tool? And I mean, in our work, we often see this issue of, you don't need a sledgehammer, the LLM. You might be able to use a small language model for the tool that the issue you have. And if you can have, as civil society, why do we not have a sovereign inference where we're running a bunch of GPUs to be able to process this stuff in more secure and closed ways? So I think the biggest takeaway on this important question is that we are not beholden to certain tools that exist. We can create tools for civil society that answer these kinds of problems, so that our rightful fear of engaging with some of these more arguably nefarious tools isn't our only option. And we can be empowered to use these tools and to be able to then, use these, as the person asking the question commented, these wonderful tools, but in a way that negates some of those fears of engaging with only a few tools and platforms.
And Angela, sorry that I missed your hand up. But yeah, really grateful to have both your perspectives on that. If I may, there is a session starting in half an hour where I think we could continue to unpack this question on data sharing in service of human rights. And for those in the room, that's downstairs in room 3016. And for those that are interested in joining that online, you can find the calling details on the RightsX Summit website. I will conclude with a huge thank you to all of our speakers today. Hadi, Dana, Angela, Simon, Jesse, very much appreciate you sharing your time and perspectives with us, and looking forward to keeping the conversation going and more so to advancing collaborations and as best we can, considering the constraints shared that we've just discussed. Also, a huge thank you to everyone that joined, and in particular to my colleagues for helping to set all of this up, Katya, Anissa, Warren, and many others that have helped with the organisation. Thanks again, everyone, and looking forward to seeing you in other sessions.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye. Bye.